Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending this roundtable today. So our topic today is AI ethics and social implications of AI, a very timely topic. And this roundtable is organized by the Ethics and Early Career Committee of TILOS, our NSF AI Institute. And TILOS is a partnership of faculty from different universities. So this includes UC San Diego, MIT, National University, University of Pennsylvania, UT Austin, and Yale University. And the goal of TILOS is to advance research in optimization for AI and AI for optimization with applications in chip design and robotics and communication networks to solve hard problems there. So maybe a little bit about the two moderators. I am Stefanie Jegelka. I'm a professor in the, an associate professor in the Department of EECS at MIT. And I'm chairing the TILOS Ethics and Early Career Committee. So we are organizing it in that framework today. My co-moderator is Jodi Reeves, whom you already met. She's sitting up there in my Zoom. And she is a professor and department chair of data science at National University, and she is the associate director for the education and workforce development at TILOS.
Great, thank you so much, Stefanie. And thank you to all our panelists who are here today, as well as the audience. Over the next roughly 40 to 45 minutes, we'll be asking our three panelists to share their thoughts on AI ethics, both in research and in the societal applications of artificial intelligence. And then we'll try to save about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So as we begin, and maybe our audience can mute themselves. I just heard a little echo there. So as we begin, I'd like to introduce our three guest speakers. We have Dr. Nisheeth Vishnoi from Yale University, Dr. David Danks from UC San Diego, and Dr. Hoda Heidari from Carnegie Mellon University. So first, I'd like to ask each of our panelists the same question. First, Nisheeth, then David, then Hoda. Can you tell us a little bit about your research in AI ethics? Nisheeth?
Thanks, Jodi. Thanks, Stefanie. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. So my work in AI ethics centers around two things. One is fairness, and the other is privacy. In fairness, I've been trying to look at the notion of group fairness. So broadly speaking, you can view fairness from an individual's point of view or from a group's point of view. I've mostly focused on the group fairness aspects of algorithms and policies, and looked at various assumptions that people make on data that might be responsible for the lack of fairness, so as to say, and figure out ways to mitigate these effects of bias in various algorithmic settings. In privacy, I've been looking at the notion of differential privacy, which is used to ensure that people's data remains private, whatever that means. Differential privacy is one notion of it. And here I've been using and designing various optimization and sampling algorithms to be able to compute various functions privately. Besides research, I also organize at Yale. I co-founded this Computation and Society Initiative in 2019 with the goal of bringing together people from various disciplines to have discussions around data science, machine learning, or AI, and social sciences, and broadly humanity.
Thank you so much. David?
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me. As somebody who's not normally a part of TILOS, it's exciting to get to be here. So my work on the ethics and also policy side with AI is primarily focused on really questions of what are the practices that we should be using in order to produce more ethical, trustworthy, responsible, whatever adjective you prefer, AI systems. And then, of course, to ask that question of what practices we should be using, how should we actually develop the systems, what methods should we use, requires, on the one hand, thinking about what the goal is. So a certain amount of philosophical and conceptual work about what does it actually mean to build ethical AI? Is that even the right way to think about it? And I'm sure we'll get into some of those kinds of questions as we move through this, but also thinking about on the educational side and on the tool side, how do we make sure that people have the tools and knowledge that they need to carry out those practices? So as a couple of concrete examples, one project that we did was trying to develop a tool for data scientists who might not have training in ethics or thinking about the societal impacts of what they're doing, to be able to do what we called ethical triage. Essentially, how do you know when you should pick up the phone and call somebody who does have that training? If all I'm going to do is, build an algorithm that will optimize server loads and balance server loads, I probably don't need to call somebody like me who has training in ethics and philosophy. If you're going to build a face recognition system and deploy it across a children's hospital, please call somebody like me. Right, that's a case where it's entering, there's sort of and that's an obvious one. People know to make that call. And so the goal was in many ways to try to be able to have a tool that could enable people to very quickly figure out which of those worlds they're in. When should they call somebody? Where, of course, false positives are no big deal. If they give me a call and I'm like, nah, you're okay, it's fine, you can go ahead. But false negatives are really bad because it means that somebody's moving forward with a project that has real ethical implications without having thought through all the details. So that's an example of a sort of project that I think helps to build different practices for the people who are, have a degree in data science or computer science or electrical engineering. Another project has been looking at different ways to think about the nature of bias. So I think there's a tendency when we think about algorithmic bias to focus on cases where the algorithm has statistical variation between groups in ways that we think it's problematic. But in many ways, I think we should think about bias not as those statistical skews. Those are evidence that there's something going on, but it's not constitutive of morally problematic bias. So trying to develop new methods and tools that enable people to look at these statistical properties and then make inferences about what kinds of biases might be underlying the data that they're seeing. So again, it's trying to make it practical for, one of the biggest employers of robotics engineers these days is John Deere, the agricultural company. So, how do you take the person who's a mechanical engineer, graduates having had maybe one engineering ethics class and is dumped into a company? How do we help them, make smarter decisions as they're building robotic tractors? Is a lot of it. So anyway, I'll stop there because I know I'll have plenty of time to talk more.
Fascinating. Thank you, David, especially the ethical triage. I never heard that before. That's a great topic to think more about. And Hoda, what's your area of research in AI ethics?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me as well. And so what I'm thinking about how I'm going to respond to this question, I think there is going to be a lot of overlap with what Nisheeth and David already mentioned. So maybe I can take a historical perspective on my own path to this point. So I started out focusing on issues of fairness and bias through the use of machine learning, in particular in socially high stakes domains. But over time, is there a connection problem on my end? I see a message that my internet connection is unstable.
There's a tiny bit of lag, but I can still hear you okay.
Okay. Let me know if you have trouble hearing me and I can try resetting my connection. So so as I mentioned early on, my focus was how do we measure outcome and distributive formulations of unfairness. And over time, what I, along with many others in the community, started noticing is that even if we just want to focus on very narrowly defined notions of distributive fairness at the end of the machine learning pipeline, still we need to have a much better understanding of what are all the biases that can creep into the machine learning pipeline, the pipeline that produces the model that ends up producing unfair, quote unquote, outcomes in the end. So there was this broadening of the framing to the machine learning pipeline. Now, as this area of research continued to mature, including my own work, the framing, I feel like we keep realizing that we need to expand the framing in order to capture more and more nuances. Otherwise, the kinds of work that we produce won't have the impact we want. So I would say the second round of expansion to the framing was thinking about the broader social and context around this technical artifact that's the machine learning pipeline, thinking about the researchers, developers, and practitioners of the machine learning or AI system we're dealing with. We have the institutional decision makers and users of those systems. We have impacted community members. And last but not least, we have oversight bodies. Now, corresponding to each of these stakeholder groups, there are some critical questions that we need to answer. One that I am these days very interested in is this idea of making sure that impacted community members have a voice early on in what kind of systems, what kind of AI systems get built, and whether there is any way in which we can claim that those systems serve their interests. When it comes to researchers, developers, and practitioners, I very much share David's thoughts here that there is a great deal of need for developing the right processes for them. Instead of focusing on outcomes, we need to shift our focus to the processes. Based on my experience interacting with practitioners on the ground, what you end up seeing is that AI is really not a very mature technology. We don't really have the right standards, best practices, and processes around it. And the few that we have, most people don't know of them and don't know when to use them. So developing the right processes, developing the right educational toolkits is definitely another area of focus for me. And I think last but not least, one area that I've become particularly interested in lately in collaboration with my ethicist colleagues is this idea of broadening the framing of what are we talking about when we are talking about AI ethics. At this point, I would say there seemed to be some kind of a consensus around 5 or 6 different principles: fairness, transparency, safety, and so on and so forth. But is that really enough, right? So depending on the context, depending on the person that's interacting with the AI system, there could be all sorts of other much more salient considerations, broader the issues that should be in our mind as designers and researchers in this area.
Thank you very much to all 3 of you for these insightful summaries. So let's go maybe into a few more specific topics. The first question that we had was, I mean, we've all heard that the news are full of stories about good and bad aspects of AI. And one thing that I'm curious about is, like, what do you think are some of the most noteworthy societal aspects of AI models and machine learning that we should all know about? And I know there's many, so you can answer this with a specific to your research. And I'd like to first direct this question to Hoda and maybe follow up a little bit in that context to the broadening of the framing and talking a bit more about specific societal implications that we should be aware of.
Absolutely. So one issue that I think deserves a whole lot more attention, and we haven't, as a research community, I think we are starting to recognize how important this is this idea of whether the AI system really serves the goal that we start out with. Whether, if you do a careful cost analysis, not necessarily, I'm not thinking about just with numbers, but if you think about what are the benefits that it can plausibly have, and what are the costs that you can anticipate it generating, does it even make sense to go ahead, right? So this idea of whether the use of AI as a technology in the given the particular task and the particular goal we have, whether that's a good idea. So this relates to issues of validity. And I'm using the term not in the machine learning sense, which is kind of like cross-validation, but rather in the social science use of the term. So I think this idea of validity of machine learning is very important. Again, making it even broader, the idea of justifiability, whether we can come up with a system that functions. So I think these are questions that we should ask very early on, and I think these are questions that need to be much more front and center for before we go ahead and come up with a model. Then think about, okay, what are the ramifications? How do I somehow adjust this model so that it doesn't look as bad, right? So how do I manage the symptoms? So that to me is one specific aspect that has that deserves more attention. And the other one, I think, are issues of governance and accountability. We can produce as many measures, methods, and processes and approaches as we want, as long as there isn't any incentive for, we aren't going to make a whole lot of progress. And I'm actually encouraged to see that there is a great deal of interest in AI accountability and governance these days, not just in academia, but also on the policy side. So I think those issues of functionality and accountability, to me, are issues that needs to become much more front and center compared to what has been the main focus of the area so far.
Thank you, Hoda. Nisheeth and David, would you like to add anything to that?
I guess I'd like to add on to what Hoda was saying at the end about accountability, and in particular to also raise the importance of thinking about issues that I know Hoda's thought a lot about, which are issues of recourse, which is it's not enough to just sort of wag our finger and or blame a company afterwards when something goes wrong. It's also a question of recourse. Essentially, how do we give people the ability either to be made whole after a harm that occurs, or otherwise not have the harm occur again in the future. And I think that that's a particularly challenging problem because it really is at the intersection of the technical and the societal. You can't do recourse with certain kinds of models. They just don't give you the information you need to design a good recourse system. Of course, you can have the most explainable, all the counterfactuals and hypotheticals you would want from the model to design a good set of recourse if somebody is denied a loan, say. But if you don't embed it in a proper regulatory system or broader societal structure, it's going to be useless for people. So I think that that's another big one. I don't know, Hoda, if you wanted to say anything specifically about recourse, but I think that that's a really key part of the accountability step that we as AI engineers can really contribute to.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that is a key area in which we need to have better mechanisms of participation, right? So I think recourse goes to this broader idea of participation, that people who get impacted must have a say, they must have some kind of a power to impact the outcome in the case of recourse, but more broadly, they should have more of a say in the kind of systems that even get developed from the get-go. So I very much agree with that.
Thank you.
I would just like to add a little bit to this discussion. I think a lot of this excitement about AI, driven by things like ChatGPT, GPT-4, which is upcoming, I guess, is largely centered around a very narrow slice of the population, which is US-centric and maybe parts of Europe. I think if you look at how these technologies perform, when you take people from other areas of the world, I think they are terrible. So the point being that I think one of the, so while in the context of US, in the context of the Western world, I think having access to such tools does have tremendous societal consequences. It levels the playing field. So for example, if you are somebody who wants to write an essay to get into Yale, you can put in whatever you have in ChatGPT and say, write it in a specific manner, and it gives you really polished, beautiful essays. So that's in that sense, it's actually leveling the field. But on the other hand, it's also creating a huge disparity between this part of the world and other parts of the world. So from what I know, I mean, people who've been using this in countries like India, I mean, it's really not that great. So I think the debate somehow on where this technology is going and what it'll have, what impact it'll have, has to also broaden up a little bit to take into account the whole planet, I would say.
Excellent points. Thank you all so much. Now we'd like to take a deeper dive into something that's been brought up, algorithmic bias. And David, you had mentioned it earlier, and that's one of your areas of research, as well as the relationship of trust, both between humans and humans, but humans and machines. So can you share some examples with us about what you mean by trust and algorithmic bias?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it to a reasonable length because, of course, this is a topic that we could easily go on for many hours about. When we think about trust, I think there's a tendency, or it is commonly the case, that people either think it's about my subjective feeling. It gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling, the technology or the person, and that's what trust is. Or people think of it as simply a willingness to use. If I'm willing to use a system, I must trust it, because otherwise, why would I use it? Without thinking about the fact that it may be that I'm using it because I don't have a choice, because my employer mandates it, for example. So I think it's important when we think about trust to really understand the relation of trust as one in which essentially the trustor has good reason to believe that the trustee, whether a human or machine, is going to act in ways that support and advance the trustor's values, right? So if I trust Jodi to watch my kid, it's because I think I have good reason to think she's going to make choices that would be advancing the value that I have of my kid being safe, right? It's why you'll trust the bank with your money, but you won't trust the bank with your kid, because they have certain values that they advance, and protecting the health of your child is not necessarily one of them. And so I think that the reason I sort of go off in that somewhat abstract, what might have looked like a digression, is because I think that it makes it much easier now for us as developers of AI systems to think about what it would be for people to trust our systems. What it would be is for our systems to actually advance the values that are of importance to those folks. One key value for many people is fairness. A related but not identical key value is justice, right? Fairness and justice are not identical, even if they are related to one another. And I think that in that regard, if we want to build trust, if we want to build appropriate trust, not just have sort of the facade of trust in our AI systems, it's really critical that those systems be appropriately unbiased. Now, I use that word appropriately because in some sense, every system is biased. In the way I think about it, bias is just deviation from what in philosophy we would call a normative standard. Could be a moral normative standard. You ought not do these things morally. Could be a legal standard. It could be a psychological standard. It could be a statistical one, right? So when I tweak my model so that it is no longer representing the historical data, I'm violating a kind of statistical norm. And that's okay. It's biased statistically so that it is unbiased morally, for example. Or I might be forced to choose whether to have a system that is socially biased or one that is morally or legally biased, because it might be that the social norms we have conflict with the legal rules. And I can give examples if people care, but that would be a longer story. And so I think when we think about trust at the core of these connections that we have and the ways in which we interact with AI systems, I think it's pretty easy to see that we need them to advance our values of fairness and justice in order for us to trust them. But that's not as simple as saying, oh, the false positive rate is the same in the two groups. Because the statistical biases, the statistical skews, or statistical parity might, it's indicative that we're getting at fairness, but it's not the same as it. We have to actually think about what the domain is, what the problem is, what are the costs of people of various false positives or false negatives, if we just take the simple binary case. And all of those, I think, are decisions that have to be made, as Hoda was saying, in many cases, before we ever get to the point of going from data to model. We have to think about and understand and engage with the communities that are going to be impacted by these systems, which, yes, it sounds like a lot of work. I'm sure there's some people on this call saying, yeah, but do I really have to talk to people? Because that sounds hard. But it's actually not that bad. It can even be kind of fun to engage with communities and understand what their values are, what their needs are, and then design and develop systems that actually support and advance those.
Thank you, David. Nisheeth or Hoda, would you like to add anything to that about trust and bias?
So I would say
like
one thing.
Make it quick.
Okay, sorry, I think there's some delay. Go ahead, Hoda. Yeah.
I apologize. Yes, I think there is 1 or 2 seconds delay on my end. I was gonna just make a quick comment about this. Again, maybe I keep going back to this idea of framing, but I personally have a little bit of an issue with thinking about trustworthy AI as opposed to other ways of talking about maybe the same broad set of principles and values, but maybe using the terminology of responsible AI. I have a tendency to like the latter and not the former. The reason being that trustworthiness, as I think David was mentioning, is kind of like a byproduct of having the right processes and producing the right outcomes, right? So, and that to me is the idea of, responsibly utilizing the technology. And trustworthiness is hopefully a byproduct of that. It doesn't, to me, make much of a sense to try to optimize for trustworthiness, to go for that as the goal. So that was the one quick comment I wanted to make. I'm sure some people disagree with me, but I, for one, I'd rather talk about responsible use of the technology as opposed to going for trustworthiness, which also has a little bit of a one-sided connotation that kind of, we do something and people should trust us, as opposed to responsibilities on us as creators.
So I just want to say, one thing. I guess we are in this discussion about AI ethics is because we have managed to encode our values into these data and algorithms. I guess the term algorithmic bias is actually very funny in some sense, because it's actually not algorithmic bias. It's human bias, which is encoded in algorithms, but it's an instance of othering. So, and I think in all these discussions, we have to be careful not to do the same thing again. Because when we start talking about responsible AI, trustworthy AI, fair AI, this or that, all these words have connotations which are culture dependent, which are dependent on people who have the power. And so we have to be careful about not to let the people with power dictate what these things mean, because that is the reason why we are in this rut in the first place. But historically, if you look at it, everything that can enable capitalists or people to concentrate power has been used in that way. So I think the battle will be very, very uphill. But I think we have to be aware not to fall into the same trap again. Sorry, I'm saying negative things. I'm hearing too many positive things from both Hoda and Danks, David. So I hope I'm just playing devil's advocate here. So just to keep the discussion interesting.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. And maybe in relation to that, and I'll direct this question to Nisheeth, given that there can be very negative consequences. What do you think TILOS, or really for that matter, any big AI project or AI institute, what could or should we do to be aware of potential consequences, ethical questions? Maybe if you have something to say specifically about like machine learning and optimization. So what do you think are measures we could take as researchers in big AI projects to prevent
let me say that 15, 20, 25 years ago, when I was doing my PhD in theoretical computer science, which is a part of computer science, I never imagined that what I'm doing would have any impact in the real world. So it was a lot of fun thinking about problems, writing papers. I think things have changed dramatically. What we are writing, the papers that we are writing can have tremendous impact. And I think the first thing we as an AI institute have to do is to recognize that we are not playing a game anymore. What we are doing now really matters. It may not be the case. So, I mean, I would say a mid-age person. So I can easily think about research as, something that I have fun and so on, but it's not the case anymore. I think secondly, I think this point has been brought up by both David and Hoda, is that we have to question everything about what comes before the model. When we start saying that we want to solve a particular problem in the real world, we say, okay, here is the data. We should not just jump from data to developing a model and developing algorithm, which is what, let's say if I teach an algorithms class, and Stefanie, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. We just start by saying that here is a problem, and the whole focus is on just designing the algorithm, right? As opposed to saying, hey, but what do we need? Is the algorithm will really do what it is supposed to do if the assumptions that we had on the data were not true? And I think just deconstructing, going back and making sure that we can quantify the assumptions under which our algorithms, optimization algorithms, machine learning algorithms work. And here I must say that I kind of, really like where the machine learning community, in these conferences such as ICML, NeurIPS, which is where many of us publish, is making us think about many of these questions. I know many people who are writing papers think that this is just a nuisance, but I think it is very important that people think about the limitations, people think about the societal consequences, because what we are dealing with now is not academic, even though we might be in academia. And I think at the same time, we also have to be aware that a lot of research that we are doing is funded by entities who have an agenda. And anytime somebody has an agenda, they have a way to encode their values into the systems that we are developing. So being in academia, I think it gives us the freedom, hopefully, to question or bring soundness to these agendas that institutions or countries might have in pushing us to develop various things related to machine learning and AI.
Thank you, Nisheeth. Hoda and David, would you like to add anything to that?
Trying to read the lag. So I guess one thing I would add is I think it's easy to think about something like optimization and think that's just math. Like, if once you've set it up, there's kind of nothing else to be done. It's just mathematics, and I think that's where Nisheeth is exactly right. It's all in the setup. It's in trying to make sure, when you use a particular loss function, why that loss function? The mathematics almost never dictate the loss function or the cost function or the optimization function, whatever term you prefer. Almost never does the math dictate using one or another function that you're optimizing. So why that one? Why are you, even if it's just something as simple as balancing false positives and false negatives? Okay, why? Are you optimizing if you're doing chip design? Are you optimizing for compute speed? Are you optimizing for power consumption? It's, you could do either one. The math in a certain sense doesn't care which one you do. And so there, I think, is really the idea of taking the moments, and I deliberately use the plural there. It's not one moment, it's multiple moments, before you get to the point of actually doing the optimization to ask, why are we doing this rather than that? Hoda emphasized the importance of thinking about these things in the design stages. And I think that's really, that's exactly right, especially for folks who might think, I just do optimization. It's up to other people to say what I should optimize. I think that's a kind of abdication of responsibility that, as Nisheeth is pointing out, we as computer scientists and AI engineers, we don't have that luxury anymore. Maybe 20 plus years ago, I guess I'm older than you, Nisheeth, so I'm really middle-aged. Maybe we had the luxury of saying, we could just do it for any arbitrary function, or we don't have to worry too much about that because nobody's ever actually going to use what we build. We don't have that ability anymore. Just to say it's somebody else's problem. We have to take it on as our own problem to really think through what we should be optimizing and what that means in practice.
And I would like to add to that this idea that optimization might not be the goal in certain domains, right? So I think as computer scientists, we have our own mental habits, right? So we have this idea of abstracting a lot of things away, making things modular, optimizing a very well-defined function. So I think these are all mental habits that even if we don't want to completely break out of them because they serve us well in our profession, we still need to be cognizant of them, right? So for example, this idea that let's think about all the realm of all ethical concerns you may have about the use of ChatGPT as a writing assistant, right? So I would argue that it is very difficult to think about those kinds of questions as an optimization. There are all sorts of concerns that you may have. They interact with each other in very complicated and nuanced ways. So I think I'm using this as just one example of questioning our mental habits as computer scientists. And I think that's important to at least make sure students are aware of. And more broadly, I think going back to a point that both Nisheeth and David raised, I think it is important to instill in our students that, at this moment in history, being a good engineer means that you need to be aware of the broader context in which your product and your design is going to be used. It's part of your job to think about it. It's no longer, I'm just going to do the cool math. So I think that's another messaging that I think we need to make sure we have in our technical courses.
Thank you all. That was very insightful. I want to ask a bit of a follow-up question onto this and about this and to all of you, and that is like, if you had some advice to give to the people in the audience generally who are developers of machine learning methods, and this includes the junior researchers and maybe people who are outside of academia, is there advice you have for them, for the people who develop machine learning models with respect to the questions we discussed?
Yeah, I think don't assume anything. I mean, ask. If you have data, ask questions about data. Where does it come from? How was it collected? Why is a particular representation chosen over the others? You may not find answers to everything, but I think it's a good habit to get into to question. I think things that we take for granted. Similarly, so that's at the input end. At the output end, ask where will the outcomes potentially be used? Even though you might be designing an algorithm for a chip, and you might say, what kind of ethical concern that might have. Well, but 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we were thinking the same thing about stuff that is important now. So I think just asking questions about input and output, and then doing the thing that you were doing before. You might be doing the same thing at the end of the day, but I think just doing it with more awareness means a more rounded outcome, I would say.
I would advise people, make friends with philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and get lots of cups of coffee with them. You don't need to become an ethicist to think about the ethical implications of your work. But there's enormous value in explaining what you're working on to somebody who comes from a different disciplinary perspective and who might see things or ask questions that you don't know to ask. So when Nisheeth is saying, ask lots of questions, you may think, yeah, but what am I supposed to ask? There are people on your campus that this is what they do, is figure out what questions to ask and to ask those questions. Befriend them. Most of us who have a degree in philosophy, we don't bite. We're not that weird. And I think that it sounds simple, but I know in my own career, the work that I do has been transformed, not because of taking classes, not because of getting a degree, but because of the people that I know and who are willing to talk to me about the questions that come up and about the questions they consider. Most of what I know about policy comes from these kinds of conversations with people over cups of coffee. And I think having a network that goes beyond computer scientists, having a professional network that goes beyond computer scientists and that you take advantage of, it's easy in a certain sense and it's fun. So I strongly encourage people to do it because it'll lead to better work.
I just want to strongly second both Nisheeth and David here. I think it's extremely important to think critically about our work as people who do machine learning. Given the amount of hype that there is around this technology these days, it is very easy to feel like, oh, this is a very cool hammer that I have, so everything should now turn into a nail that I can hammer down. I think that's a tendency that we need to be aware of and question it. So and I think the suggestions that Nisheeth and David offered are spot on.
So I'll just add to David's suggestion that, I think to also interact with people who may not be in the same socioeconomic category as you. I think this is really important. It's very nice to befriend professor friends who are in your elite institute, who are philosophers or computer scientists, but I think it's even more crucial, I would say, to understand the needs of the masses, because ultimately, if we want to have a stable society, we need to understand what people, and being in such elite environments, it's not easy to have any sense of what is going on in the real world. So I think that is also very important, which we through AI institutes, we have these outreach programs and so on. The purpose is not just to transfer what we know about AI to them, but also learn from them what we might be missing in the design, which might not come from these discussions.
So that was great advice to those who develop AI and develop machine learning methods. What advice would you have for those of us who use it, whether we know it's under the hood or not? What advice would you give to us about things to be aware of ethically as users of AI and machine learning?
So I think the most important thing as a user, and this is not always easy information to gain, but the most important thing I would say is to have an understanding of the failure modes and failure conditions. Where are the places that the AI system is being pushed outside of what it was designed for, or where it has been tested? Not because it's necessarily going to fail, but because it enables you as a user to be protective, to recognize that you may need to take steps to watch for errors and failures that happen. I mean, we're seeing this happen in real time with self-driving vehicles in the form of things like Tesla's full self-driving mode, where people are having to learn, oh, it fails in these kinds of conditions, so I probably don't want to use it. But that extends to all AI systems. I mean, as we all know, there are, all AI systems, there were assumptions that went into the construction of it. And so when those assumptions are violated, the system is not necessarily going to work anymore. And that's not the sort of information I think that users are typically provided. Usually we are told when we use an AI system, oh, in these conditions, here's how well it worked. Yeah, but what about when we're outside of those conditions? That's often more important to me as a user. So I think that's the biggest question I would suggest, is for people to ask or try to find out where and when does the system potentially break down, so we can be more conservative and cautious in those places. The other thing I would say is to ask whether you need to use AI at all. It has tremendous value in certain contexts, but there's a tendency to just say, this is the hammer we've got, so everything's looking like a nail. We're seeing this with generative AI right now, where people are using large language models for what I think are very strange purposes and not why you would normally have thought you would use them. They're using LLMs to do supply chain management. I'm like, we've got 70 years of operations research. Maybe we ought to not be so quick to give up on all of that kind of thing. So that, that's the other piece, is if you're a user and you have a choice about whether to use it, which you may not, but if you do, ask whether this is actually the right thing to do. It might not be.
I would like to basically just add to David's comment by saying that there is also the need to know when AI is being used in certain contexts. In some of the interactions I've had with people who interact with these tools, sometimes they even have a hard time naming where exactly AI is being used, in part because they don't know what AI quote unquote means, right? So it is, I think so, it is important for people to have a high level understanding of what these technologies are. I think large language models are a very good example. Every time I talk about these large language models, I start out by demystifying them, telling people how these are simple statistical models of language, which and all they are trying to do, as impressive as the outcome can be, all they're trying to do is to come up with a statistical model of language, given what has been uttered so far, what's the most likely next word. And yes, they end up producing a very sensical sounding, very legitimate looking paragraph, but or a longer document, but that's at the core what it is doing. So if you have that understanding, as opposed to, oh, this is a sentient being, it may at some point become threatened by me and try to kill me and so on. So if you have that realistic understanding, I think that really changes what kind of claims you end up buying and what kind of claims you can reject right off the bat.
I would just add to it, as a user, I think one should not overestimate their own intelligence. In many senses, I think human beings have this capacity to think of intelligence in a very narrow way. For example, the ability to do mathematics or the ability to speak a language. But a lot of learning that is happening even inside us is very unconscious and subconscious driven. And in some sense, these AI algorithms are similar. So being a bit more aware of how you're learning when you're interacting with these systems, which is not just through reasoning or language, is also very important. And I'm referring to things like social media and other things which are already getting deep inside you through unconscious ways in which you're learning. So I think that's what my advice to people who are using AI-driven tools, which is like everything pretty much now.
Okay, thank you all for answering these questions. Now we'll open it up to questions from the audience as well. If you have questions for our panelists here, please type them in the chat. If there's someone, or raise your hand, and you can also ask it directly. Okay, I see Tara has a question.
And I'm too lazy to type it, so I apologize. Not good with, the technology, I guess. So I guess I want to follow up on something that Nisheeth mentioned that I think is really important, and kind of maybe even take it a little bit further and problematize this. And this is something that I have been thinking a lot in the context of AI Institute, which is I'm going to phrase it slightly differently, and then I would like to hear everybody. So as a woman in STEM who has been very critical of certain language around outreach, I've been really concerned about the separation of the conversations around inclusion and diversity and the questions of ethics. Many AI researchers of color have argued for participation of actually developers more than just communities being involved in terms of the outcome. So this is our institute and a panel that is, in some sense excludes the significant communities that have been critical and have been affected. How should we go about that? Like, how can we run away from repeating the same issues we have had in broadening participation and having outreach language that missed, like, I as a, woman in science, I was very critical of like panels that were all men talking about outreach for women. And so are we reproducing the same thing? And where would we find ourselves accountable? And how should we go about that in the framework of TILOS? And leave it like that.
I completely agree with you, Tara. I mean, I think even when we were writing the proposal for TILOS, I remember pointing this out, that it's not that what we can give to these communities, it's what we can learn from these communities, which is more important, I think. I think being academics, we're constantly surrounded by people who look up to us. We get this feeling that we have to give. When I think in this particular instance of AI ethics, we first have to learn what we have to give. And only then we can give in a manner which is enabling as opposed to disabling. So I think interactions with communities at the ground level becomes really important. And I think this interaction has to be focused on learning as far as we are concerned, as opposed to going there and teaching them about machine learning models. This very colonial mindset that in some sense that we have, that look, we are the great people, we go to these communities and we teach them how to do math. We teach women how to do this, we teach, and I mean, if you look at all these statements that people write in their broadening participation, it's largely centered around this. You see what I'm saying? I think this mindset has to change, that we have to learn from these communities, and only then we can talk about inclusion and diversity. I think that's, and I think we
I guess I'm even asking, and I'm even asking to be critical and sort of be mindful. So I, just to pick on David, because he's we work closely on this issue in a different program that I'm running. Even disciplines have not been the same, and what can we learn, for example, from philosophy's history versus ethnic studies, right? So I see a lot of, or women's studies, right? I see a lot of women philosophers who found their jobs in departments that were, due to historical definitions of what philosophy departments were like. So what can we learn in those practices that help us not to repeat the same sort of exclusionary, things that we're doing subconsciously, right? So we, even in participants in the computing side, how can we combine broadening participation, computing with these conversations, and not treat them as two separate things?
I think part of the challenge is that, and here I would lay some blame at the feet of funding agencies because of what they tell people they want to see. The focus when we think about things like broadening participation or diversity is almost always on bringing people from various communities that have been historically underrepresented in computing or other academic disciplines and bringing them into the academic discipline. And I think what Nisheeth is pointing to, which is really critical, is how do we get the people in the academic communities to go out into the communities, rather than thinking, well, we don't turn anybody away. We're welcoming. It's not our fault that if this group is not diverse. I think that is a pretty common mindset to say, we have an open door. Why aren't people coming? Without recognizing all the ways in which members of various communities don't feel comfortable, say, on a university campus, or don't feel comfortable in some of these discussions. And so the importance of going out into communities, actually engaging with them, actually engaging in co-design, not being extractive about the data that we collect, where it's like, okay, thank you for your data. We'll be back in 6 months, maybe with something that you care about, but probably not. I think that this takes a real change in the ways that we do research and the ways that we fund research. I mean, right now, if you go to NSF and say, I want to be able to pay participants in a community $5,000 for 3 months of engagement, and I need $300,000 because I need 60 people, and I'm going to pay them only $5,000. I don't see that getting through NSF. They're going to say, no, you don't need to pay people in the community for all of their time. That's just the reality right now. And so it's not that I'm trying to in some way absolve TILOS from doing things, but simply saying that I think it's important to recognize it can't be a matter of just opening the doors and inviting selected people in. It's got to be us getting out of our chairs and going to, whether it's other departments on our own campuses or going out into communities and spending time to learn what the challenges really are that people address and what the values are, and working collaboratively rather than in an extractive way. And I know those are all big slogans. It's hard. Like, it's not easy, it's not fun, it's not rewarded. And so I think that that's a big challenge, is also changing incentive systems.
Thank you. So we have a few more minutes. Let me just ask one more question from the chat. Do you have any thoughts on the recent congressional hearings and news on the need for new governance approaches and guidance for AI? So the question about policy and governance, do you have any thoughts on that? I know it's a long question, we have short time, but if you have some thoughts on it, it'll be very interesting.
I can provide a quick response, in part because I've been thinking a lot about some of the requests for comments and requests for input from various governmental agencies interested in developing AI governance frameworks. I think what I've been observing is that these kind of requests for comments from the public and academics being a part of them, they have definitely grown in maturity. So I see that as a very welcome and positive development. So where early on, it was clear that policymakers and regulators have no idea what they are talking about. I think the things are becoming much better understood on their side. I'm not sure if the question is getting at congressional hearing involving, certain industry leaders. Those I'm not so sure the kind of purpose they serve. I think the part of the policy efforts that are going on around actually developing governance frameworks, for example, NTIA has put out a very thoughtful request for comments in the past couple of weeks. So those I think are great, and I very much look forward to see what develops out of those kinds of processes.
I would also note that there's a rapid rise in efforts to try to use existing regulatory powers. So I think the flagship example of this is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which over the last 6 to 8 months has come out with multiple letters, essentially telling companies, we don't care if you use AI or not. We're going to continue to regulate your hiring practices in exactly the same way based on the outcomes. So use an AI in your hiring if you want, doesn't matter to us, but if you are thereby having discriminatory outcomes, we're going to investigate you. And if you're upset and you want to sue the company that sold you that AI hiring software, that's on you, we don't care. So I think that we're seeing a rise in regulatory agencies who are recognizing that their regulatory powers are often tech agnostic. And so the fact that companies started using AI creates a technical barrier because their agencies don't know how to think through those puzzles, but it doesn't mean that we need new regulatory authorities. They already have the authorities they need. And that'll be an interesting thing to watch in various sectors like finance, hiring, healthcare.
Okay, thank you, Nisheeth. Any closing thoughts on that topic?
No, I think it's great that these these things are happening, and I'm usually cynical about I think what are the processes which are leading to these But I'm hoping that these hearings are also being driven by people reaching out to their Congress person or senator, pushing them on things like what David is mentioning. Like, we need to make sure that these companies which are using AI cannot hide behind the curtain. So I'm hoping that this is driven by the masses as opposed to the capitalistic interests of a few people who are worried now that there can be chaos and the wealth can be redistributed and concentrated in a different way. So I think at a grassroots level, we have to continue doing what we are doing, and all the points that Hoda and David and others have made. I think it's we have to push from the bottom. We have to empower the citizens, and I think irrespective of what the agendas from the top might be, and even if you have to swim against the flow, as David said, there are no incentives to do the kind of stuff what we are doing, to be very honest, right now, other than us developing a sense of community and making sure that we have what we do has a positive net outcome on the world that we live in.
Okay, thank you. So we are at the top of the hour. There's lots more questions we could ask. We should do this again at some point. But for now, I would like to thank all of you for attending today's discussion. It was organized by the Ethics and Early Career Committee of TILOS. And especially, I would like to say a big thank you to our panelists, to Nisheeth Vishnoi from the East Coast, David Danks from the West Coast, and especially Hoda Heidari, who's attending from Japan. So it's like a weird hour at the night right now. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for the very insightful discussion, and thanks to the audience for listening and asking questions. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.